Hello, I am Dr. Leah Farrow, and I am very happy to be here giving this presentation to you, and I hope it'll be of interest to you. I am not an expert in cuisine per se, but I am from the South. I've grown up in the South, and I've traveled a lot in the South, and I've given a talk on this before, and I thought that it would be something that might be particularly interesting to this audience. So let me go ahead and click on my presentation and get started. All right, so first of all, I want to start off with just a brief introduction about life in the southern United States. So like all countries, the United States has various regions and they have sort of distinct characteristics. Obviously, the United States is one country and there are many commonalities across the country, but there are some things that are sort of unique to the South. One of the first questions, of course, is what constitutes the South? And honestly, I think that's it's sort of up for debate a little bit. So depending on where people are from, they consider themselves to be more or less Southern. So I was born in Louisiana, which of course is the first red state on the left. I now live in Alabama, which is 2 states over. And these states are usually referred to as the Deep South because these are the places where you had the greatest number of traditional Southern farms or plantations during the pre-Civil War period. This is where you had, of course, a lot of slavery. But of course, there were other states in the area that we're looking at here that also had slaves and plantations. So Virginia, for example, which is actually in that northern band of states in this colored area, is very much Southern, but it is usually not referred to as the Deep South. So a number of years ago, and I tried to find this study for this presentation, I couldn't track it down again, but years ago there was a story that I had heard about a research study where they tried to define what constituted the South by looking in telephone books to see where people referred to themselves as the South. So for example, if there was a business, a car dealership that said Southern Cars, or if there was a restaurant that said Southern Food or something like that, they looked to see where businesses identified themselves as being in the South. And they had drawn some lines based on those self-descriptions in the telephone books, which I thought was a very interesting way of looking at it. But as I said, I couldn't find that study, but I did find this map of, a more recent definition of what constitutes the South. So by and large, these states, have, of course, very warm weather. There tend to be some other characteristics that we share. So these are some things to know about the South. And these are stereotypes or general descriptions of the South, but I will say that these are the ones that I actually will say are true, right? So, for example, the first, outside of the big cities, and we do have, of course, many big cities, but outside of those big cities, life tends to move a little more slowly. So people in the South tend to have a more laid back approach to life. So if you go to a big city like New York, you find people moving very quickly and people don't smile and they don't make eye contact. And so, you get that feeling that everyone's in a rush. But here in the South, you do find that people move a little more slowly. Things seem to be a little more relaxed. Religion is a big deal in the South. This is very true. So in the town I live in, which is Montgomery, Alabama, you can drive around and see a church within, a couple of, every couple of miles. There are churches everywhere. And church culture is very dominant here in the South. People often have Bible quotes on their vehicles or on their email sign-offs, signature lines. Sometimes when you call someone and you have to leave a message, their outgoing message says a Bible quote. People have religious stickers on their cars. So the South is very religious by and large. There is an area that's referred to as the Bible Belt, which is a very conservative religious area. And one thing that I think is very different about a lot of the South is that religion is not only is it important to people, but it's very open. So it is out there. It is not uncommon for someone to um, ask you about religion very quickly. So when you first move here, people will ask you very quickly, which church do you go to? So religion is not only important, but it's very, everyone wears it on their sleeve. It's very much an open part of interactions and conversation. Consequently, because religion is so important, people tend to be more conservative here. So politically and socially, you see that in the South, people tend to be more conservative. We have a lot more red states in the South with, bright blue dots where liberal people live in cities or certain areas, but overall, people tend to be more conservative. Unfortunately, it's also true that education is underfunded in many places. So unfortunately, one thing that is a general rule about the South is that you have a lot of places where education does not receive enough funding, and therefore literacy rates are lower, success rates are lower, the actual dollar amount spent on students is lower. And just in general, the feeling is that education is not made a priority the way it is in some other places. That does not mean people here are stupid, and I want to clarify that because having come from the South myself, I encountered that stereotype when I moved, when I went to do research in the North or when I went to Russia for the first time. But it is true that education is not given the priority here that it is in other places. But I do want to emphasize that the South is a very diverse place with lots of regional differences. So just like, as I said, any place else, we make generalizations, and those generalizations are rooted in reality. But at the same time, there are lots of regional differences as well. And we do have in every state, no matter how agricultural and conservative it may be, there are big cities where things tend to move faster, people are more liberal, education is more important, and so on. So there are a couple things that I can say that are true about the South. Certain things are very important here. So country music, and I'm sure that you are familiar with lots of country music artists. So we tend to think about country music being important in the South. College football and sports in general. So starting from the time that kids are little here, they often play baseball or football. I mean, starting at the age of 5. Unfortunately, and again, I'm giving my own input here, my preference, right? Parents are often willing to spend money on sports where, they're not willing to pay taxes for educational purposes. So people will spend money on sports down here. I'll tell you, they'll spend a lot of money on sports, but education doesn't get as much funding. But college football is very, very important. So I mentioned to you a minute ago that when you first move to a city like Montgomery, people will ask you very quickly when they meet you, which church are you going to? Or they might ask you, have you selected a church? Have you chosen a church? Because they'll invite you to theirs if you haven't. But they also will ask you which football team you are a fan of. Because in Alabama, for example, there are 2 big teams that everybody roots for. University of Alabama, which is in the north of the state in Tuscaloosa, and Auburn University, which is the sort of sister school to my university, and it's about an hour from here, and it's again another big football school. So that's the big rivalry in the state of Alabama. And so it's not a joke to say that when I first moved here, those were the 2 questions I got asked the most, whether I was going to root for Alabama or Auburn, and which church I was going to go to. Actually, because I'm from Louisiana, I still root for LSU, which is the team from Louisiana, even though, I don't really care about sports that much. The third thing that matters a lot to people down here is food. And, in the South, we like a lot of heavy, fattening food that is what we call comfort food, the kind of food that reminds you of your mom or your grandmother, hearty food. So let's talk about the food now. Now, some of the, again, stereotypes, or not stereotypes, some of the common themes that we can see in a lot of Southern food is that the origins tend to come from similar backgrounds, right? So a lot of the origins of some of the sort of staple items of Southern food come from our history, come from slaves who brought various diets, various recipes, not written, of course, various styles of food um, from the Caribbean or from Africa. So a lot of the food that we eat in the South that are traditional dishes have some of that influence. Of course, makes sense that a lot of our food is based on the kinds of local crops that were grown in the area. And then finally, I sort of characterize a lot of the food that we eat in the South as poor food. So I think every culture has this, right? Where there are certain dishes that are clearly made up of kind of the stuff that was left over or available that you could throw together. So if you think about what maybe like a beef stew looks like or some other kind of dish like that, it's often all the pieces and parts that you can throw together to make a hearty meal, right? Because the goal is to get as many calories and as much satisfaction out of that meal so that it sustains you. And so that's why you have things like potatoes and, meat and things like that in it, right? So you want it to be hearty. You want it to be something that keeps you going a long time. So a lot of the food that you'll see that we'll talk about in a moment comes from that kind of influence as well, right? It's stuff that would have been inexpensive to make for people with large families, that it wouldn't have been a very fancy cooking. It would have been the kind of thing that you could put on the stove maybe and let cook for a while you were doing something else. And it's hearty food that will sustain you, will really fill your belly and keep you full for a while. All right, so let's talk about some of the food that we love in the South. One of the things that we love in the South is something called grits. Now, grits is highly controversial in the sense that people from other parts of the country often don't like grits. Grits is made from cornmeal, and it is served hot. You can see on the right, this one is just served with butter. On the left, it is an entree that you might eat in a restaurant with peppers and shrimp. So this is called shrimp and grits. And this is a very hearty meal. I love grits. I like them just plain with butter. People put cheese in grits. That's really delicious as well. A lot of times when I make it at home, I will actually I'll crack an egg into it as I'm cooking it, stir it up so that the egg gives more protein and flavor. This is a very hearty meal. Again, it will fill your stomach. And it's it's easy to cook. You just throw it in some water and boil on the stove, and then you season it with whatever you want. This is typically a breakfast food. So whereas in other parts of the country, people prefer oatmeal or something called cream of wheat. For example, you guys would eat kasha, right? Same kind of thing. And it's a salty dish. So it's savory. You salt this. It's not a sweet dish. But as I said, a lot of people don't like the texture. I don't like the texture of oatmeal that much. I think it's a little slimy. This, I think, is perfect. But again, this is a personal preference thing. So this is something you'll see both as a breakfast dish, and it's been upgraded to dinner menus and lunch menus when these kinds of items are added to it, like shrimp or even sometimes other types of meat. Another thing that we're known for in the South is barbecue. And this is when, meat is grilled over an open fire, usually, and a sauce is applied to it. Now, there are different kinds of barbecue. So there's this kind, which is what we would call a wet barbecue. Whoops, I need to go back. A wet barbecue because it has a sauce that's being spread on it. But there are also dry barbecues where people take seasonings and they rub it onto the meat before they cook it. It's very debated about who has the best barbecue in the South. So Memphis, Tennessee is known for its barbecue. Texas is known for its barbecue. And again, just as is true in other parts of the world, right? Different cities or different states will kind of argue over who has the best barbecue. But this is again, if you think about it, this is a way of slow cooking meat. And if you cook it long enough, it gets that smoky flavor, and it tends to break it down so it becomes more tender. And this is a very common thing for people to eat, especially on holidays like the 4th of July. It's associated with kind of summer weather because you're cooking outside. So when people have gatherings, picnics, parties in the summertime, oftentimes that would involve barbecue. And you can barbecue ribs or other types of meat. Chicken is often barbecued. Pork is barbecued. And you'll see a lot of barbecue restaurants if you come to the South. Another thing that we eat, and again, you can understand this is like a satisfying, filling dish, is biscuits and gravy. So the biscuit, of course, is just a round piece of bread, often associated as a breakfast food. But the gravy is usually made with flour and like the drippings from some kind of meat that you've cooked. So you take the oil that is cooked off of some kind of meat, and you cook that with the flour to make a rich gravy that is served over a biscuit. And again, you can imagine why this would be the case. Not only does it taste delicious, but it gives the biscuit a more substantive quality. So it is more likely to sustain you longer because it's got that, meat base in it. This is the kind of thing that's very fattening. So, I love biscuits and gravy, but I don't ever make it at home. This is the kind of thing I'll eat if I go to a restaurant for breakfast, or if I'm lucky enough to be invited someplace, or if I'm staying in a hotel that has, like a breakfast, and I'll treat myself and let myself have this. But it's heavy and fattening. So it's not the kind of thing that you want to eat every day if you're worried about your health or your weight at all. But it is delicious. All right. Now this is something that's a traditional sweet thing that we have here in the South. So, of course, lots of areas in the South have grow pecan trees. And a pecan tree, I have one in my yard. Pecan trees are, these very tall trees that produce nuts. And when you crack the nut open, there are two pieces like this, the whole nut that you see on top of the pie, two pieces like this, and then you break them apart and you have two pieces of pecan that you can eat. Pecans can be very expensive to buy in the store if you ever get the chance to try them. If you haven't already, I'm sure you have, but they can be very expensive. And, down here we do all sorts of things with them. We use them in cookies and candies and fudge and all sorts of other treats. But one of the standard things that we do is we make pecan pie. So the center part here is this gooey sweetness made of dark syrup. So like cane syrup, sugar syrup. And that is cooked with pecans. And then, of course, you layer some nice pecans on top to make it visually attractive. And this is incredibly sweet. It is so delicious. It is sometimes served with ice cream. Pecan trees grow in many areas of the South. In Texas, they grow them, Georgia, Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi. So kind of that area that I refer to as the Deep South. I'm not sure exactly how far north they grow, but they are definitely a giant part of the diet down here in the Deep South. And there's an economy to this. So there are pecan plantations, there are pecan farms where this is the industry, where there are huge numbers, fields and fields of pecan trees, and those are harvested, and then they're run through machines to crack the shells and get what we call the meat out. And then that is packaged and sold either in small bits or whole pieces like this. And there's a whole industry around this. So people make their livelihoods off of selling these. And even unofficially, sometimes you might know someone who has, several pecan trees in their yard, and they will harvest these pecans and sell them, for a certain amount of dollars a bag or something. If you're lucky, someone who'll give them to you for free. But because they, as I said, they can be pricey, but especially around the holidays at Christmas time, when a lot of us are doing baking, we all need pecans in our kitchens because we're going to be making things with them. but that's a really delicious dessert if you ever get the chance to try it. Another thing that's very predominant here in the South is what we call sweet tea. So, and this is sort of a funny thing because if you go to other parts of the country, the tea will not automatically be sweetened for you, and you will receive a glass of iced tea that you will have to add your own sweetener to. But in the South, it tends to be the opposite. If you want tea that is not sweet, you have to ask for unsweetened tea. Otherwise, you will be brought this. And what's different about this tea is that it's not tea to which sugar is added. It's actually the sugar is boiled into the water before the tea is made. And that way there's a lot of sugar in it and it's completely integrated into the tea itself. Whereas if you get a glass of iced tea or even hot tea, as you know, and you just add sugar to it and stir, it will dissolve. But in this tea, it's sweeter because it's made from the beginning, and it's very sweet. I don't drink sweet tea; it's too sweet for me. Um, but many people love sweet tea, and again, there's sort of like a competition between restaurants who has the best sweet tea, that sort of thing. In any given town, people will say, this place has the best sweet tea. But when I go to a restaurant, when I order tea, if I order tea, I will have to say unsweetened tea. Otherwise, I'll get a glass of this stuff, which is so sweet. It's like drinking, to me, it's like drinking syrup. But people love sweet tea. And it's often served with lemon on the side. Now, of course, as I said, there are regional variations. So in certain areas of the South, the food is very distinct and even famous, I would say. So one of the places is New Orleans. So as I said, I grew up in Louisiana. My mom's family is Cajun French, which means they were descended from Acadians who came from Canada, and they are known for their cooking. And so some of the dishes that are associated with New Orleans are, again, these kinds of hearty dishes that are a combination of things, because people weren't very rich. And so you were throwing together a bunch of stuff to make a really good meal. And so one of the things that New Orleans is famous for is gumbo. So this is on the left here. It is a very hearty soup. It's really a soup. It starts with a roux. So that's when you mix flour and oil and cook it, right, to get it a brown base. And then you add things. And people will add all sorts of things. So my favorite is my mother's chicken and sausage gumbo. You can see the picture I have here has shrimp. People will put all sorts of things in gumbo, any kind of seafood, oysters, crab meat, shrimp. They'll put sausage, chicken, all sorts of things go into gumbo with all sorts of vegetables, tomatoes, bell peppers, onions, all sorts of seasonings, lots of pepper and salt. And it will be very flavorful. And that's actually one of the things that New Orleans food is known for. It's very flavorful, not just spicy, because some people think food in Louisiana is going to be spicy, that it's going to be hot with lots of pepper. That's not it. It's a mixture of spices. So onion, garlic, salt, pepper, bell peppers, tomatoes, lots of flavor to the food. It's not just one flavor, it's lots of spices together that make a really wonderful taste. And again, this is just a traditional dish. It's served over rice. And you can find it all over Louisiana, but especially in New Orleans. Another dish that's very famous for this area in New Orleans and Louisiana in general is red beans and rice. So these are beans, lobio. You would recognize them as beans that you eat as well. But again, here they tend to be slow cooked for hours with sausage and ham or a ham bone, something like that, that will give it flavor. Lots of garlic, salt, pepper, and it'll just cook for hours until those beans start to break down, and then you serve it over rice. This traditionally was a dish that was served on Monday nights because Monday was laundry day for women. And so they would put this on the stove. It could cook for hours while they were busy doing other things. And I think a lot of these dishes are like that. You might, for example, with a gumbo, you have to watch it when you're starting because you can't burn that initial part. But then once you've got that going, you can just put everything in and let it simmer for a while. So I think a lot of these dishes you see, there's a practical element to them as well. But red beans and rice, again, very, very hearty, high protein, very satisfying. And again, not just spicy, but flavorful. We use a lot of garlic and a lot of our food, I think, tends to be salty too. So, but very, very delicious. This is one of the things that I like to make. And again, it's just such a comfort food because it reminds me of the food I ate growing up. Another thing that we make in Louisiana is called jambalaya. And by the way, you might hear somebody on television or in a movie saying jambalaya. That's not right. There are no sharp as in Cajun French, right? So it's people don't say jambalaya or something like this. It's jambalaya. Everything's kind of those round sounds. And this is, kind of like gumbo in the sense that it's a bunch of stuff thrown together. So in this case, it's rice based. So it's like a pilaf with chunks of meat, and it can be all sorts of meat. Again, you can have shrimp in there. You can have sausage. You can have, pieces of ham, and lots of seasonings, and you can put tomatoes in there. You can put bell peppers, all sorts of things. And again, you cook that, and that's something you can cook in the oven and it, for however long. And it's a big dish and not very expensive to make. So you can make a giant, dish of this for not very much money. Serves a lot of people, very satisfying, very flavorful. Okay. And then another sweet treat from specifically associated with New Orleans is something called beignets. Of course, this is the French influence coming into Louisiana. I think we all know that every culture seems to have their version of this, right? Some kind of fried dough with sweet stuff on it. So you have like sopapillas and Mexican food, and you have ponchiki in Russia, and you have, all sorts of cultures have these sort of like sweet bread-like things. In New Orleans, these are very famous. There's a restaurant that's very famous for making these, Café du Mont. It's down on the edge of the French Quarter. It's just pieces of dough that are fried until they puff, and then they're covered with powdered sugar, refined powdered sugar, and served with coffee. Absolutely delicious. Again, horrible for you because it's just fried bread and sugar, but absolutely delicious. And this place, I'm not sure how late they stay open these days. I think they close at midnight or something. But when I was a young person living in Louisiana, when my friends and I would go out, we would end up here because after, going around and going to a bar or something, this was a good thing to eat at the end of the night with a cup of coffee to sort of like get yourself ready to drive home. Very, very safe, very, very delicious. And this is something that, when people go to New Orleans, this is a pilgrimage site. People make an effort to go to this place and get beignets. And people will ask you, oh, did you go to Café du Monde and get beignets? So it's a really kind of a very famous thing to do when you go to New Orleans. Another thing that we make in the Deep South is derived from pecans as well. And by the way, we do say pecans, not pecans. It's pecans, again, the round sound. And then again, these are called pralines. They're not pralines. You might hear people say pralines, but in Louisiana, we say pralines. And all this is a candy made of cooked sugar and pralines. So I make these. They are insanely delicious, insanely sweet. So it's just a bunch of white sugar that you cook with cream and liquid syrup, like Karo syrup, white syrup, and then you cook it until it starts to form a candy, and then you throw the pecans in. You scoop it out onto a surface and you let them cool. And they are insanely good, so delicious. When I make these, I make sure that I give them away as quickly as possible because I don't want these sitting in my house because I will eat them all. But they are a great gift because they're not easy to make. Not everybody, if you've ever made candy before where you have to get the sugar boiled to a certain level, it has to be the right temperature. I don't use a thermometer. I just learned how to do it from someone. But if you overboil it or you underboil it, they won't set correctly. So not everybody knows how to do this, and so people really consider these a treat. But and they are so good, but they are sweet. So, but this is something, again, if you visit the South, if you visit Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, you'll see these for sale. Okay. Another thing that we are known for is the poor boy, or we call them po' boys. And as you can see from the slide, this actually originated with a strike. And this one shop was making sandwiches for these strikers, and the name poor boy got associated with the sandwich. Um, and again, a po' boy can be almost anything. So it's a big piece of bread, a French baguette, and then it's just all sorts of stuff put inside. So in this case, on the right, it's fried shrimp. On the left, it's a ham and cheese po' boy. You can have a roast beef po' boy. You can have all sorts of things on this bread. And again, not very expensive, a very hearty and satisfying meal. So this is a very popular thing to get if you come to New Orleans. All right. Now, when we talk about Alabama and Georgia, one of the things that grows here are peaches. So this fruit is a part of a lot of dishes here that people really love. And you'll see lots of places that specialize in peach dishes. There's even a place about an hour north of here. It's called Peach Park, where you can go and get almost anything you can imagine made out of peaches. It's a kind of a roadside restaurant. During early summer, you can buy fresh peaches because there are lots of peach farms here. And again, peaches are absolutely delicious, as you probably know. And there's nothing like a fresh peach or a fresh peach made dish. So these are 3 examples of the way people love to eat peaches. So a lot of places will make peach ice cream. Up here on the top right, this is a peach cobbler, which of course is kind of like a deconstructed peach pie, which is pictured below. So this is where you kind of cook the peaches, and the crust is on top, and you dig into it with a big spoon, and it's served warm. The peach pie is a little more organized in terms of its arrangement, but it's sort of the same thing, right? Oftentimes these are served with a scoop of vanilla ice cream, but you see a lot of peach dishes in Alabama and Georgia. Another regional variation, which makes sense, is in Miami, Florida, which is a weird state in terms of considering it southern. It is in many ways, of course, situationally or geographically it is, but Florida has so many other influences, a lot of Spanish influences, and influences from Cuba. So it's a very different place. Plus, we also have a lot of people who migrate either forever or seasonally from places like New York. So there's a strong Jewish community in Florida as well. But in any event, one of the regional variations you find in Florida is Cuban food. And the plate here is very typical for Cuban food. So black beans and rice cooked together or separately are very common in any Cuban dish. And then, of course, they cook a lot of meat with seasonings and peppers. That's very common in Cuban food as well. And then also down here, you can see sort of what looks like sauteed plantains. So that is this fruit that's shown to the side here. It looks like a banana, but it's not exactly a banana. It tastes sort of like a banana, but it doesn't have as strong a flavor. I would say if there's any banana flavor, it's very small and mild. But this is a staple of Cuban food. So you'll find plantain chips, plantain cooked this way. Sometimes it's savory. So sometimes it's served with salt. Sometimes plantain dishes can have a sweetness to them, or that combination of sweet and salty, which is very good. But Miami is known for its Cuban influence and its Cuban population there, and there are a lot of very good Cuban restaurants in Miami. Another regional variation, of course, is Mexican food in Texas. So this is often referred to as Tex-Mex because it is Mexican food that has been adapted for the American palate in Texas. So it's not as spicy. It uses some different ingredients. So of course, real Mexican food tends not to use the dark yellow cheddar cheese that we use in the States, but instead their cheeses tend to be whiter. Um, but Texas is known for having great Mexican food. So driving through Texas, you will see a lot of Mexican restaurants, and of course, everybody knows what Mexican food looks like. A lot of their version of the easy to eat. Hearty food is often associated with, instead of rice, although they do have rice dishes, always with some kind of tortilla, either a flour tortilla or a corn tortilla. Again, lots of mixtures of vegetables and meats that go together with sauces and spices to make something that's very delicious and hearty. And then I think finally the last variation I'm going to talk about is what we refer to as soul food. So soul food is associated with the African/African American population in the South. Again, it's very difficult to track the origins of all of these dishes because over time they were changed and influenced by all sorts of different, things. But these are some of the things that are typically associated with the idea of soul food. So on the left here, fried chicken. Again, chickens are easy to come by usually, right? You coat it in something and you fry it. Very delicious, very satisfying. This is collard greens. So this is a leafy green vegetable that is cooked down and served sort of like you would serve maybe cooked spinach or something, right? But again, with lots of seasonings, usually with ham, maybe cooked even with like a ham bone or pieces of ham to give it that nice salty and pork flavor. And then this is cornbread. So this is cornmeal mixed with like eggs and milk and baked. Again, just like with all of these dishes, there are regional variations, or family variations, family preferences, and also people swear by a certain method. So this one I'm going to mention, there are people who swear that the only way to cook cornbread properly is to cook it in a big cast iron skillet like this. I don't like cooking cast iron because it's so heavy. I think it's incredibly cumbersome and difficult to use. But there are people who swear that the only way you can get good cornbread is if you cook it in a cast iron skillet like this. And I know you guys are familiar with these kinds of things in your own cuisine, your own foods that you cook, right? That people will swear that there's only one way to do something correctly, and that's the way they do it. In the South, this is a very typical thing to talk about. How do you cook your cornbread? And in fact, I had a friend who, for my birthday present, bought me a cast iron skillet and came over and cooked cornbread for me because she was appalled and shocked that I didn't cook it that way. So people do take that very seriously here. A few more things associated with soul food. Again, stuff you'll recognize. So these are called black-eyed peas. It's a bean, very hearty and high protein, and it's often cooked with collard greens. And again, maybe ham or ham bones. A very savory dish. Macaroni and cheese. I know that you're familiar with this. And then sweet potatoes. So these are, referred to as yams or sweet potatoes. They're a potato that is, orange on the inside, very high in vitamin E and, basically good for you as far as potatoes go. And these are served a variety of ways. So people will cook them this way, where it's a savory dish, and puree them, and they are very delicious. They have a natural sweetness to them. Sometimes people bake them like potatoes. but this is a very common dish to see on a Southern table. The last two things I'm going to refer to are things that we eat with certain holidays. So in the South, it's very common for people to cook these two dishes on January 1st and serve them on New Year's Day. Black-eyed peas, which are supposed to be for good luck, and cabbage, which of course you're familiar with, which is supposed to be for money. And growing up, my mother always cooked black-eyed peas and cabbage on New Year's Day, just as a tradition, to bring you good things in the coming year. And I did a little bit of research, because of course, just because your family does it doesn't mean everybody does. But it's a common thing in the South, and it is a Southern thing more than a Northern thing. And then finally, this food is specifically associated with Mardi Gras. So I'm sure you guys know what Mardi Gras is. It's the big festival that's held in a couple of cities in the South and it was actually just a couple of days ago on Tuesday. It is the sort of big last celebration before Lent begins for Catholics, or the same sort of like big long religious period that happens before Easter, right? And which exists in various forms. Mardi Gras originated in Mobile, Alabama originally, but then it was adopted by New Orleans, and now New Orleans really is more famous for Mardi Gras than Mobile. New Orleans has a gigantic Mardi Gras celebration. And one of the foods that people eat during Mardi Gras is something called a king cake. Now, this also comes from French background. So, of course, Louisiana belonged to France for a good long time. And so, some of our traditions come from France as well. And this is one of them. In the original version, the cake had like a bean in it and other things. But over time, it started to have a little baby in it. And when I was growing up, the baby was always embedded in the cake, like this slide down on the left here. In more recent years, because of lawsuits and lawyers and things like that, a lot of companies don't put their baby inside anymore. They put it on top, and then it's up to you, the purchaser, to stick it into the cake if you want to. I like it when it's in the cake because that's more authentic to me. And the tradition is, if you have, let's say, so for example, during the season, beginning in January until Mardi Gras, people will buy these king cakes and bring them to parties or to the office. And then, of course, people eat them, and then, it's somebody else's turn to bring. Well, the question of who gets to bring the next cake is determined by who gets the baby. So if you get a piece of king cake and when you eat it, you find the baby, that means you're supposed to bring the next king cake. Now, as you can imagine, this leads to some shenanigans. So sometimes when people are, don't want to be the one to bring the king cake, they will take that baby that they just found and they will shove it back in the cake so somebody else gets it. Or they might just put it on the dish, and then somebody comes to get the next piece of cake and they see the baby's just out there in the open. Nobody knows who got it. But the tradition is, if you get the king cake baby, you are supposed to buy the next king cake. And, I don't live in Louisiana anymore, and we do sell king cakes here in Alabama, but it's not as much of a tradition as it is in Louisiana. But when I was in Louisiana, at the office or wherever it was, there was always almost always a king cake available on the counter, so somebody would bring a king cake, and then when that one was all eaten, somebody would bring another one. And so for weeks, you have king cake. The traditional ones look like this. In more recent years, they have made them very ornate and fancy, and they've added all sorts of things. So the traditional cake that I grew up eating was like this. It was just a sweet bread covered in colored sugar and icing. But over the years, they have added things to them. So now there are king cakes that have filling of all sorts of things, chocolate, strawberries, things like that. There are some that are even different flavors. So this last weekend, I was in Louisiana visiting my family right before Mardi Gras, And there was a king cake that was like this, only it was entirely chocolate. So the whole king cake was chocolate and the filling was chocolate as well. Um, but again, the pure original king cake was this. But now, of course, there are just, there are a million variations because everybody's trying to make money off of this. And people are, curious about the different flavors. And some people like the other flavors, but I really prefer the basic one. So I've covered a lot of territory in a short period of time, and I've probably made everyone very hungry for lunch or dinner, I guess in your case. And I am open to receiving questions at this point. So the question is, what influence did Native American cuisine have on U.S. Southern cuisine? I think that certainly there is some influence, especially when it comes to the use of corn in a lot of our dishes. Um, I don't think it's as prevalent an influence as some of the others that I mentioned, but certainly a lot of the foods that I've mentioned were involved some kind of corn in the diet, and certainly that would have come from that influence, I would think. Any other questions? What are the boundaries of Southern cuisine? Where are the boundaries of Southern cuisine? If you're asking the boundaries as in geographically, again, I would have to say it's kind of that map that I showed at the beginning, but fuzzy. The boundaries are fuzzy because, of course, now you can go to Vermont and you can find a Cajun restaurant. Well, sometimes that's a person from Louisiana who moved up to Vermont and decided to open a restaurant. Sometimes it's just somebody up there who decided to open a restaurant and call it Cajun. And I mean, I'm a purist because I grew up with some of the best cooking from my mom. I do not eat at restaurants that are called Cajun restaurants in other states because I know it's not going to be as good as my mom's food. But if you are born and bred in Vermont and that's the only Cajun food you have access to, then you probably like it. So yeah, you'll find these kinds of things all over the country now. But the truest, best food you'll get is, of course, in the place where it originated. Any other questions? Question 3, how popular is home cooking? Yeah, so I think that, I think it depends on the region and the family, and also I think generationally. So I think that more and more young people cook less. I mean, I think that's probably an international trend, right? I mean, with the availability of ready-made foods, I think a lot of people will, opt for that. But I do probably think that in the South and some other parts of the country, home cooking is still something that's seen as valuable. So it's part of the culture, not just about, it's not just about eating for survival. It's about eating for, flavor and for time with family. And also, bragging rights. So, I think that people in certain parts of the country really care a lot about cooking as something that is a reflection of the culture, and it shows something about their part of the world that is different. So I think it really depends. But in the South, I do think home cooking is real important. Is bread popular? Okay, so we do all eat a lot of bread, I would say. Different types. We don't eat dark bread here. So I love dark bread, but it is not very typical down here. As a matter of fact, in a couple of weeks in my class, I'm a Russian historian by training, so I'm planning on doing a Russian food day in my class. And I'm going to have to make my own dark bread because I don't think I'll easily be able to find anything that's close. We do have small bakeries, but not as much as you might see in Europe. And they tend to have it's less just bread. It'll be a lot more sweet things also. Any other questions? Is everybody hungry and ready to go and eat something now? No, we don't just eat hamburgers and hot dogs. Although, our fast food restaurants are almost always hamburgers. The major chains like McDonald's, all of those are hamburger based, of course. But no, we have a much more varied diet than that, thank goodness. Um, in general, I think I would say beer. But again, it depends on the person and the event. If you think about any kind of party, um, any kind of gathering, like outdoors, that's almost always going to be beer. Like a barbecue and an outdoor party in the summertime, it's going to be kind of a beer based event, I think. um, and if you, for example, there's a big race that actually my family and I are participating in April in Louisiana, and it's a 10K. At the end of that race, there's going to be a giant party. They're going to be serving jambalaya and red beans, and they'll have beer there. They're not going to have wine. They'll have beer because it's kind of considered a summer thirst quenching kind of drink. Um, and wine would be kind of more of a quiet evening party, I think. So, but we do drink wine. And somebody's asking for the recipes. So, yeah, that's fun. Let's see, share the recipes. So there are a million different recipes. I can say that, and I like my mom's version. My mom didn't really make pecan pie that much. So I would recommend you just find one online, from a, like Southern cooking recipe, but, I like my mom's jambalaya, and it's got sausage and ground meat and rice, and I think it's very good. So I'll see if I can't share that. What are the ways to get original recipes? Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I have a ton of cookbooks. My daughter, who's now in college, has a lot of cookbooks. I think that's still, and like I said, when I make pralines, um, the praline is something that I learned how to make from my aunt. And the first quote unquote recipe I had from her was just written on a piece of paper with no measurements. It was just like a big spoon of this and stir for until it looks like this. It was very imprecise. And now I don't even have a recipe. I just know how to do it myself. So yeah, I think that it's still very common in Southern families to pass down recipes. The sweet potato dish that I make was my grandmother's recipe. So yeah, for sure. What's more popular, sweet tea or coffee? Well, so you drink them at different times. So people tend to drink coffee more than hot tea in the South. But with lunch, or dinner, you would drink cold iced tea, cold sweet tea. And then you might have a cup of coffee after the meal with your dessert. But definitely the coffee is sort of the thing everybody drinks in the morning, with few exceptions. The influence of African cuisine on the cuisine of the southern states. Do I watch any cooking shows? So I have to say, okay, let me answer the last one first. I'm actually a lazy cook. I don't like cooking if it involves lots and lots of steps. Um, and I think that's just because, like, I watched my mom cook with, everything my mom cooked was sort of straightforward, simple, satisfying kind of stuff. So not like French, high cuisine. It wasn't like Julia Child kind of stuff. So I don't have a lot of patience for that kind of stuff. I'd rather do something else with my time, to be honest. So I tend not to watch cooking shows on TV, but my daughter loves them, and she doesn't mind spending an hour making something very fancy. I just don't have the patience for it. But those shows are obviously very, very popular in the United States. Like the Great British Bake Off, whatever that show is called. I've never watched it. I know people are crazy about it. Influence of African cuisine. So as I said, a lot of the foods, like collard greens, these kinds of things that we call soul food, were definitely part of that African influence. Fried chicken, some of these other things are associated with this African influence. I don't know enough about the spices and things to really comment in detail on that. But I know that a lot of the foods that we eat, in especially like Louisiana and other places in the deep South, are a combination of these influences from, slaves who were brought here, with local cuisine, both the local population, the French population, and a lot of them are now just such a blend. As I said, it's impossible to go back and trace original roots. Any other questions? I think that's it, maybe. Next time I'm going to be talking about the South and language. So I'll be talking about Southern accents and Southern sayings and dialects and so on. So I hope this was interesting to everyone. And if you ever get the chance to try out some Southern cooking, whether you're making it yourself or you're visiting, I highly recommend it. Is that okay?